When we're talking about growth, we are often talking about productivity. So let's jump into that right now. 7.2. Specifically, we are going to be talking a lot about labor productivity. And how it relates to economic growth. So what economists have found is that this sustained long-term economic growth that we're looking for comes largely, yes, it comes from technological increases, but it also comes from how those increases affect worker productivity. And so when we're talking about worker productivity, we're really talking about our technical term, which is our labor productivity. Which is just the value of everything produced per worker. And then it's either per worker or sometimes it's per hour worked, which is also called worker hours, which is aggravating, but you might see that sometime. So this is also called worker productivity. And this seems like a difficult thing to measure, but luckily, we have government agencies that, we know that they track GDP, right? We know that they track, well, we will know in Chapter 8 how they track unemployment and employment. So we know we have agencies that track our output, and we have agencies that track how many workers or how many hours are worked. And so our labor productivity actually ends up being this simple formula of our GDP divided by the hours worked that year. Or you could do it GDP divided by the workers. So what is it that is determining this human capital or this labor productivity, right? What is determining this labor productivity? We talked a little bit about it, that part of the labor productivity is coming from technological change. Technological change being a combination of invention and innovation, where invention is defined as our advances in knowledge. New things, right? And innovation is putting those inventions, the advances in knowledge, to use. In some sort of product or service, right? The next part of what increases our labor productivity, or what determines our labor productivity, right? All of these are determinants. So the next one would be our human capital, a term that you will hear thrown around a lot in economics. We are all investing in our human capital by being here today, right? Human capital is the accumulated knowledge Now, this knowledge may come from education, right? That's why we're here right now, getting a degree. It may also come from, may come from experience, right? That's why, we highly recommend that you do internships. It's not just about know-how, it's also about how-to, right? It is the knowledge, the skills that you learn, both in education and experience, and the expertise. And when we talk macroeconomics and we talk about the economy writ large, we're talking about the average worker. Possesses. And then our last determinant, which we're not going to talk about too much, but it's just an important one to mention, is what's called economies of scale. So we see this especially in the tech sector, right? It costs a lot of money to start a Facebook and market a Facebook and get everybody to, sign on to Facebook, right? But then adding an extra user once the internet platform or the service, the service as a software, whatever the case may be, the marginal cost of extra users is very low, right? So economies of scale, specifically, we're talking about the cost advantages that industries obtain due to size. So when we're talking about economic growth, we will often talk about a production function. And a production function in microeconomics is talking about firms or industries. And specifically how they take their inputs and turn them into outputs. In macroeconomics, we're looking at the inputs of the entire economy and how they become outputs. So oftentimes when we talk about an aggregate production function, we will have something where it is our GDP, often represented as our Y, is equal to some sort of function of our human capital, our physical capital, K, and our technology, which we always use as an A. This is our physical capital. This is the human capital. So we use this to split apart this GDP into the various elements that it can be, right? The GDP is determined by the size of the workforce. If your workforce is small or sick or leaving the country, right, that's not going to be good for your economic output. It's determined by the human capital of that workforce. Oh, right, sorry. I actually made a mistake over here. So workforce, right? Workforce is going to be L. And so that means that in this function over here, we're going to have an L as well that's talking about our labor force. Again, that's a term that we're going to define in the next chapter, what our labor force is. This is just all the people that are actively participating in the labor market. So these aren't people that are in education, full-time education. They're not full-time retired. They're not children. They're not babies, so on and so forth, right? They're not incarcerated. So one of the things that we find when we are looking at this aggregate production function and we're trying to figure out what's happening with the growth rate of an economy, we will oftentimes, instead of looking at the GDP writ large, we will look at just the GDP per capita. And specifically, some of the things that we look at when we're looking at GDP per capita is we're going to look at human capital per person, physical capital per person, and then the technology, again, per person. And one of the things that we find when we're looking specifically at GDP per capita is that the growth rate of our GDP per capita is closely linked to our growth rate of our productivity. And one of the most common measures in terms of growth rate of productivity is going to be the dollar output per hour. Per hour worked. And these exclude, this particular measure excludes government workers and agricultural. So farming and ranching, right? Excludes those. And so what we found over time is that our GDP per capita has really followed this productivity measure. The productivity measure, increases during certain technological booms, like during the 90s when computers and the internet first came out. We have found that there has been a slowdown of productivity in the last 10, 15 years. And economists are kind of worried. We don't know if this is the mark of a new economy that might not have as high of a productivity growth as when we were undergoing that information revolution in the 90s and the 2000s, right? So part of why we're talking about all of this is because having small growth consistently is better than having erratic high growth. So we're going to talk about that next when we talk about the power of sustained economic growth.